In the bitter grip of the Pennsylvania winter in the year 1823, a series of deaths began to unfold that would haunt the records of a secluded seminary forever. 15 young men, bright, devout, and full of purpose, died within 6 weeks of each other. All were students, training for the exercise, and all suffered identical horrifying symptoms: violent, uncontrollable convulsions, sudden outbursts in what sounded like ancient tongues, and most chilling of all, a creeping blackening of the fingernails that no doctor had ever seen. The official record, of course, calls it consumption. That old catch-all diagnosis is so often used to explain the unexplainable. But the local physician disagreed. He not only refused to sign their death certificates, he claimed that what he saw did not resemble any known disease. Then that very night, he disappeared from the county. After burning every page of his notes, whatever he saw in those boys' blood made him abandon his entire life. The church wasted no time. The seminary was sealed shut by sunrise. The grounds were declared off limits. The 15 bodies were buried in unmarked graves behind the chapel, and the incident was buried just as deeply by the Presbyterian Church. For over 200 years, not a word. No official inquiry. No memorial. No public explanation. Just quiet until now, because a set of long-forgotten letters penned by the only known survivor of that terrible winter have recently surfaced. And what they describe is so disturbing, so profoundly strange, that it may finally explain why some truths were never meant to come to light. But before we descend into the cold shadows of Whitmore Seminary, let me ask you something. Where are you listening from right now? Let me know in the comments. Are you in Pennsylvania? Maybe even close to the rolling hills where this story began. Wherever you are, if you're still with me, it means you're not like most people. You're part of a rare kind of listener, the kind who isn't afraid of the dark, the kind who needs to know what the world tried to forget. This channel isn't for everyone. It's for you. So if you haven't already hit that subscribe button, and stay with me, because we're only at the beginning. Our story begins in the pastoral hills of western Pennsylvania in the year 1819. The American frontier was still wild, then stitched together by dirt roads and stubborn settlers, and the Presbyterian Church had grand ambitions for spreading civilization into those untamed lands. Thus was born Whitmore Seminary, named in honor of the late Reverend Josiah Whitmore, a Revolutionary War martyr turned spiritual icon. The seminary's location was remote 200 acres of thick forest, nestled among groves of ancient oak and maple. Its buildings, made of local limestone, stood modest, but dignified a main hall, a stone chapel that seated 50 dormitories, a dining house, and humble faculty cottages, all connected by mossy cobblestone paths. There was even a working farm to sustain the students and faculty, making the institution a self-contained world of faith and purpose. Whitmore quickly attracted young men from across Pennsylvania and neighboring states. Most came from modest beginnings, sons of farmers, blacksmiths, millers, eager to answer what they believed was a divine calling. They came seeking education, yes, but also transformation to leave behind the old world and emerge purified as soldiers of Christ. The seminary was rigorous, and so was the process to get in. Each applicant had to present glowing letters of recommendation from local clergy, demonstrate academic ability, and most importantly, provide a detailed account of their personal calling to the ministry. Once accepted, life becomes a strict rhythm of study and prayer. Days began before sunrise and ended in candle-lit dormitories with aching eyes and worn pages. The students were submerged in ancient languages, Greek and Latin, so they could read scripture in its purest forms. They studied exegesis, theology, church history, and the art of preaching, known then as homiletics. They were expected to attend chapel twice, daily maintain impeccable moral standards, and never ever question authority. For most, it was a challenge. For a few, it was a death sentence, because within just 4 years of opening, something began to seep into the stones of Whitmore. Something older than scripture. Something that did not care for holy ambitions or the innocence of youth, and it began to choose them one by one. The Presbyterian Church in those early decades of the Republic believed itself to be the guardian of moral order along the American frontier. It took this burden seriously, especially when it came to prepare young men for the lonely, often dangerous task of shepherding scattered congregations across vast, untamed lands. Men of God would be expected to ride through blizzards. Ministers in log cabins debate scripture with backwoods mystics and bury the dead on windswept hillsides where wolves still howled. For that kind of ministry, they needed more than sermons. They needed grit, wisdom, and an unshakable faith. By the autumn of 1823, 43 students were enrolled at Whitmore Seminary, and among them was a cross-section of the American soul, grief-stricken widowers, orphaned sons, curious philosophers, and boys burning with the hope of redemption. The oldest among them was Marcus Hartwell, 28 years old, a former schoolteacher from Lancaster County. His path to seminary had been carved by heartbreak. His wife had died in childbirth 2 winters before, and her death had broken something inside him, but also awakened something else. A calling. He arrived at Whitmore somber and quiet, already well read in theology and philosophy. His classmates regarded him not only for his intellect, but for the steady, grounded presence he offered especially to the younger boys who came from much more fragile beginnings. The youngest of them was barely 18, Timothy Brennan, the son of Irish immigrants who had scraped together every coin they could find to send him there. Timothy's father had died in a mining accident when the boy was just 14. His mother had stitched clothes in a boarding house attic for 4 long years to fund her son's dream. And Timothy carried that sacrifice like a stone in his pocket. Every night long after curfew, he could be seen in the dormitory window, face lit by candlelight lips, moving in Latin hands, dark with ink. Then there were the boys in between. Samuel Brewster, son of farmers, full of stories and laughter. His family had worked the same land in Lancaster County for 3 generations, and he was built like an ox and smiled like he meant it. Samuel believed that joy was a kind of ministry too. Even in the bitter winds of seminary life, he tried to bring warmth where he could. Peter Cunningham was his opposite, soft-spoken, pale, and intense. Raised by his grandfather after a fever swept away, both parents, Peter, rarely spoke during meals and spent hours alone in prayer. He fasted often too often, his roommates said. Sometimes they'd wake up and find him kneeling beside his bed lips, moving silently in the dark. James Morrison came from money. His father, a wealthy Philadelphia merchant, who had very much preference that James continued in the family trade. But James had other plans. His gift for languages was unmatched at the seminary. His Hebrew and Greek were flawless, and he had a poet's memory for scripture. Some professors said he would become one of the great theologians of his generation. But James never seemed interested in fame. He had come to Whitmore to escape the city's noise, not chase it again in a pulpit. Thomas Milliken was the one who always asked questions, sometimes too many. His professor called him restless, but not without affection. Thomas had grown up in Pittsburgh, a city of brick steel and argument. He brought that energy with him to Whitmore. He read beyond the syllabus Locke, Hume, Kant, and wanted to talk about everything. Reason, revelation, heresy, how truth could exist inside mystery. Some of his classmates found him exhausting. Others found him brave. And then there was David Crane, a quiet, practical young man from the hills of central Pennsylvania. His family were farmers, and he came to seminary not from a vision or epiphany, but a slow, patient conviction that God was calling him to serve. David didn't shine academically like Thomas or James. He didn't pray like Peter or joke like Samuel, but everyone trusted him. He was steady, kind, and when the nightmare began, he would become the only one to survive it. But we'll come back to that. For now, let us turn to the figure who presided over all these boys, who guided them in life and for many into death. Dr. Cornelius Ashford, 50-something, gray-bearded, Oxford-collared. He had studied at Princeton Seminary under the famous theologian Archbold Alexander, and carried with him a reputation for brilliance, order, and discipline. When the church called upon him to build a seminary in the wilderness, he answered without hesitation. His name brought prestige. His methods brought results. Ashford lived on campus with his wife Margaret and their 18-year-old daughter Sarah. Margaret was no passive preacher's wife. Educated herself at a Philadelphia ladies' seminary, she managed the domestic side of Whitmore like a benevolent queen. She cooks for the students, advised them, encouraged them. She could quote Calvin and comfort homesick boys in the same afternoon. And Sarah was a mystery in herself. Tall, graceful, and with eyes that seemed to see everything. She worked in the seminary library and had read more theology than some of the faculty. The students adored her, not in the clumsy way young men adore pretty faces, but with something deeper. She was kind but never meek, witty but never cruel. Some whispered that she was meant for greater things than marriage or motherhood. Some whispered other things too, that she walked the woods at night, that she knew things no girl should know, that her books weren't all theology. But gossip was a currency at Whitmore, and the truth, as we'll soon see, was far stranger than rumor. Whitmore Seminary, though small in size, boasts a faculty that rivals some of the great Eastern institutions in both scholarship and pastoral skill. The professors who walked its candle-lit halls were more than mere lecturers. They were spiritual craftsmen, sculpting souls as well as minds. At the center of the seminary's intellectual life stood Professor Jonathan Hartley, the formidable scholar of Greek and Hebrew. tall, thin, and always dressed in exactly ironed black wool. Hartley was known equally for his brilliant command of ancient texts and his dry, almost surgical wit. He had studied for several years in Germany, an experience that left him with a fondness for dense theological conservative discourse and the occasional suspicion from more colleagues. Although he maintained fidelity to orthodox Presbyterian doctrine, there was always something slightly continental in his lectures, a sense that his mind moved through deeper waters than he let on. Then there was Professor William Sterling, who brought warmth where Hartley brought rigor. Sterling, once a beloved pastor of several large congregations, had traded the pulpit for the lecture hall late in life. His students adored him. His courses on church history and homiletics, the art of preaching, were the most well attended, and for good reason. He spoke like a man who had lived the battles of Augustine and Calvin, not merely read about them. Under Sterling's teaching, even the driest theological disputes took on the drama of ancient wars, and his sermons, delivered now and then in chapel, were still spoken of years later in hushed tones. As the autumn of 1823 descended, the seminary began to withdraw into itself. That year, the cold came early. Snow began falling in October, and by November, the cobblestone paths were buried under drifts that made travel to neighboring towns nearly impossible. The isolation, though severe, was not unwelcome. Within the stone walls of Whitmore, it produced an atmosphere of intense focus and spiritual contemplation, a kind of monastic retreat. The faculty encouraged this quietude, reflections, study, discipline. The students fell into rhythm with the season. Their days became a strict cadence of prayer and preparation. They rose at 5 o'clock, still wrapped in the last dreams of night, and went straight to their private devotions, each man alone with his thoughts, his doubts, his hopes. Dr. Ashford insisted this early morning ritual was the foundation of true spiritual vitality, and few dared disobey. The cold was bone deep, but no one complaining. At 6 they gathered in the dining hall for a silent breakfast, bowls of steaming porridge, slices of coarse bread with butter, and cups of milk from the seminary's own cows. As they ate, one of the students will stand and read from a devotional text, usually Edwards, sometimes Baxter. The scraping of spoons on wooden bowls and the soft, earnest voice of the reader were the only sounds in the room. Classes began promptly at 7 and continued through noon. In Professor Hartley's Greek and Hebrew classes, students labored under an invisible weight. His recitations were notoriously unforgiving, and the faintest hesitation could earn a cold stare or a cryptic remark in Latin. Still, his brilliance was undeniable, and many of the boys secretly longed to impress him. Professor Sterling's lectures, by contrast, were vivid and deeply human. He would pace slowly across the classroom, hands clasped behind his back, weaving tales from the ancient councils, the martyrdoms, the fractures and reforms that shaped the church. Under his spell, even the dustiest chapters of ecclesiastical history came alive, and many students found their own faith deepened by his teaching. Afternoons were given over to self-study. When the weather allows, the boys will take walks through the woods, solitary or in quiet pairs, disappearing down frost-covered trails where oak leaves whispered forgotten hymns. These walks were more than exercise. They were meditating in motion, Opportunities for private prayer, for remembering psalms, or for trying to unravel the great questions that filled their days: predestination, grace, justice, eternity. The seminary did maintain a crude gymnasium in one of the outbuildings, a dusty barn equipped with pulleys, bars, and mats for calisthenics. But most students prefer the woods. Out there among the snow-draped trees, it was easier to feel the presence of God or something else. Evening chapel began at 6. The entire community, students, professors, and staff filed into the small limestone building with its tall windows and walnut pulpit, polished so smooth it looked like river stone. The services followed the Presbyterian liturgy psalms sung from memory, long prayers spoken in unison readings from both Old and New Testaments. Dr. Ashford usually preaches, his voice steady and grave. But occasionally, a visiting minister or senior student would deliver the sermon, their words echoing through the rafters like thunder in a distant valley. After chapel, there was communal study. Students gathered in the library, where over 3,000 volumes lined the shelves: Calvin, Luther, Knox, Baxter, Turretin, Edwards. Great tomes of Reformed thought, commentaries in thick, cracked leather bindings, church histories, philosophical treats, and sermons copied by hand. In this dim, book-scented sanctuary, they whispered arguments over predestination and covenant theology, over the nature of grace and the problem of evil. Sometimes the debates grew intense. Sometimes voices rose. But there was always a sense that something important was being worked out, that their very futures as ministers, as men, were being forged in those long candle-lit hours. But as the snow piled higher outside, something else was building inside the walls of Whitmore, something unseen, and soon the familiar routines will begin to break. By 9 o'clock every evening, students at Whitmore Seminary were expected to be in their rooms. It was a rule rarely broken and barely adequate. The weight of expectation was enough. Although the hour marked the end of communal life, it was not the end of study. Most students continued their reading and prayers well into the night, candle flames flickering against the frost-laced windows. The dormitories were austere but sufficient. Each student was given a small room with only the essentials: a wooden bed, a desk, a chair, a washstand, and a modest bookshelf for scripture and theological works. The hearths in the common rooms provided warmth, but individual quarters often dropped near freezing in winter. It was said that you can see your breath before dawn. The students maintained their own rooms and took part in the upkeep of the seminary grounds. Chopping wood, tending the livestock, shoveling snow, physical labor was considered part of spiritual formation. And beyond the seminary walls, nestled in the frozen valley, was the tiny community of Millbrook. Millbrook was home to just 300 souls: farmers, blacksmiths, millers. The town had a general store, a grist mill, a forge, and a small Presbyterian church where Dr. Ashford occasionally preached when the resident minister was disclosed. The townsfolk were proud of Whitmore Seminary. It brought them purpose, commerce, and a sense of participating in something divine. They came to graduations, donated goods, and sometimes sought guidance from the students themselves. But all that changed on the morning of December 3rd, 1823. It began with absence. Thomas Milliken, a 22-year-old student from Pittsburgh, failed to appear for morning chapel. That in itself was alarming. Thomas was punctual to a fault, regarded by faculty and admired by peers for his sharp mind and endless curiosity. He had never missed a chapel service in 2 years. His roommate, David Crane, thought perhaps Thomas had overslept or fallen ill with a cold. When he entered their room, the truth struck him like a blow to the chest. Thomas was not asleep. He was thrashing violently atop his bed, his body caught in some horrific seizure. His spine arched so dramatically that only his shoulders and heels touched the mattress, his limbs jerking with unnatural force. Unintelligible words spilled from his mouth, fluid and rapid, like a language learned in dreams. But it wasn't the spasms or the speaking that froze David in place. It was Thomas's fingernails. They had turned entirely black, not bruised or bloodied, but black, smooth, unnatural, like they'd been dipped in ink and left to harden. David would later say that the sight filled him with a coldness deeper than the winter outside. He ran. His shouts echoed down the corridor, rousing groggy students still preparing for the morning service. Within minutes, several had gathered around the bed, their faces drawn tight with confusion and growing dread. They tried to restrain Thomas, 3 of them strong young men, but he bucked against their hands with a strength none of them had ever seen. Then came the words. Thomas's eyes rolled back, showing only whites. From his throat came a deep growing voice, Latin it seemed, but warped, mangled into grotesque liturgical parodies. Dominus vobiscum, infernum, corpus diaboli, anima perdituta. It was Latin, yes, but not the kind spoken in prayer. These were inversions, corruptions of sacred texts, words twisted into mockery. The Lord be with you in hell, the body of the devil, the lost soul. Dr. Ashford arrived quickly, alerted by the chaos. A man known for his composure, for his refusal to yield to panic, he stopped cold at the threshold of the room. He listened, eyes narrowed, jaw clenched. He understood the language. He understood, too, what it meant. His training had not prepared him for this, not fully, and yet he acted. With no physician on hand, Ashford ordered a rider to Millbrook. Dr. Edmund Whitley, the town's longtime doctor, was summoned through snow-covered roads by horseback. Ashford then led the students in prayer, his voice trembling for the first time in living memory. Deliver this soul, O Lord, from whatever darkness holds it captive. But it was clear Thomas couldn't hear them. 2 hours passed. Dr. Whitley arrived just before noon. A seasoned man with 3 decades of medicine behind him, he had treated injuries from runaway wagons, fevers that tore through towns, and infections that blackened limbs. But what he saw that day at Whitmore, he would never speak of without trembling. He entered the room. He put down his bag. He watched, and then he began to understand. This was no illness, not one the body can produce on its own. What he witnessed in that room would go on to change his life, his work, his faith, and in time, it would make him flee. The symptoms unfolding before Dr. Whitley that day refused to conform to anything he'd seen in his 30 years of medical practice. At first glance, it seemed like a seizure. But as he listened to the erratic fluttering of Thomas's heart, beating wildly one moment, then slowing to a crawl the next, Whitley realized this was no ordinary convulsion. The pulse was unstable in a way that defied reason. If the heart had a mind, Thomas's seemed to be in the grip of panic or torment. His breathing was shallow rasping, accompanied by a low, reedy whistle that rose and fell with each effort to draw air. And there was something else. A foul, sweet odor that seemed to come not from his breath, but from within. The skin was pallid, not just pale, but grey, with an almost waxy sheen. Underneath the surface, dark veins pulsed, moving visibly, as if some separate life throbbed beneath the young man's flesh. What began with blackened fingernails had now spread to his hands. And worse, new discolorations were forming around his throat, beneath his eyes, and along the jaw. By then, the blasphemous phrases had become deliberate, inverted prayers spoken with uncanny fluency. Dominus Inferni, Corpus Sacrum Contortum. Latin that had been twisted like broken scripture, precise, articulate, and deeply offensive to anyone trained in Christian liturgy. Dr. Whitley, not a religious man by habit, found himself inwardly recoiling. These weren't just ramblings. They were constructed, structured. Each phrase seemed designed to unmake something sacred. Still, he did what he could. He administered laudanum, hoping to ease the spasms. He applied cold compresses, although Thomas's fever continued to burn beneath the surface. Then, turning to the standards of the time, he attempted bloodletting. But the blood, it ran thicker than it should have, almost tar-like, and coagulated, instantly forming clots that glistened black in the basin. He tried to purge the boy's stomach, thinking perhaps poison or fungus had caused the illness. But Thomas vomited only a jet of black bile, streaked with oily filaments and reeking of sulfur and rot. By that point, word had spread through the seminary like wildfire. Students clustered in corners, whispering, eyes wide with dread. Some, clinging to logic, speculated it might be a strange mutation of consumption, though none had seen such grotesque features before. Others wondered if Thomas had been bitten by something, a venomous snake or spider hiding in the warmth of the dormitory walls. But the most unsettling theories came in hushed, trembling voices: judgment, possession, a spiritual affliction. Dr. Ashford, upon hearing such murmurs, immediately silenced them. "You are not children of folklore," he reminded them. "You are men of the word. Seek truth, not superiority." But even Ashford, a man carved from reason and ritual, found his certainty faltering. As he sat by the young man's bed and listened to the Latin phrases rise and fall, taunts of inverted grace, mockeries of liturgy, he began to sense that something far more complex and far more ancient was unraveling beneath the fever. As evening fell, Thomas's condition worsened. The spasms returned more violent than before. His body arched, then snapped flat. His voice no longer formed words, but grotesque sounds, bestial and guttural, as though something inside he had lost the memory of human speech. And then Sarah Ashford appeared. Against her father's wishes, she entered the sick room, bearing a pitcher of fresh water and a basin of linens. She knelt beside Thomas, brushing sweat from his brow with a trembling hand. "He's cold," she whispered. "How can he be burning with fever and still feel cold to the touch?" She would later say it felt like touching stone from the graveyard. Outside, a snowstorm began to gather. Inside, the boys of Whitmore gathered in the chapel and dormitory halls, reading psalms by candlelight, keeping vigil. They took shifts at his bedside. One read from the Gospel of John, another from the Psalms of David. Their voices faded more than once, but still they prayed. At 3:07 a.m. on December 4th, Thomas Milliken died. The moment came not with a gasp or a spasm, but something far stranger. After 21 hours of horror convulsions, mutterings, cries, Thomas suddenly went still. His body relaxes. His eyes, bloodshot and unfocused, for hours suddenly cleared. His voice, so recently filled with monstrous sounds, softened. He looked around the room, and for just a moment, he smiled. "He is not who you think he is," he whispered. "He wears the word, but speaks another tongue." Then silence. His breath left him in a long, slow sigh, and Thomas Milliken, the brilliant young theologian from Pittsburgh, was gone. The room felt silent, as if some veil had lifted Thomas's body, relaxed the spasms, ceasing in an instant. His eyes, previously rolled back into whiteness, now locked onto Dr. Whitley with stunning clarity. What the doctor saw there was not peace. It was terrifying and something deeper. Regret, ancient and personal. Then, with an unrecognizable voice from the guttural, blasphemous tones that had torn from his throat for hours, Thomas spoke clearly, urgently. The book in the chapel. God forgive us all. Dr. Whitley would later write these words verbatim into his medical notes, noting that they were spoken in Thomas's natural voice, as if in one final surge of lucidity. Everyone present, faculty and students alike, felt the weight of those words, even if none yet understood them. And then it was over. Thomas's eyes are closed. His chest rose once, then fell, and did not rise again. Silence followed. Stillness like a glassy lake untouched by wind. Almost immediately, the blackness that had overtaken Thomas's hands and face began to fade, dissolving like ash in water. His skin returned to its natural pallor, the pale complexion of a young man who had died far from home in a bed not meant for dying. Dr. Whitley, stunned but composed, conducted a thorough examination. What he observed disturbed him more than he let on. Many of the grotesque symptoms, the convulsions, the swelling, the discoloration, had disappeared entirely. Whatever had ravaged Thomas's body seemed to have evaporated with his final breath, as though it had never belonged to him in the first place. 2 days later, under a slate-gray sky and a curtain of slow-falling snow, Thomas Milliken was buried. The funeral was held behind the chapel in a modest cemetery where future ministers were laid to rest when illness or accident overtook them before ordination. Dr. Ashford gave the eulogy, his voice steady, but his face deeply lined with sorrow. "A mind built for theology," he said, "a soul devoted to service. The world has lost a shepherd it never knew it needed." Faculty stood shoulder to shoulder with grieving students. Townsfolk from Millbrook came as well. Blacksmiths, farmers, even the elderly pastor from the village church. They remembered Thomas. He had tutored their children, prayed with their sick scripture, quoted with reverence and ease. Timothy Brennan, the youngest student at the seminary, wept openly. Thomas had been his mentor, his older brother, in all but blood. He clutched his Bible so tightly, his knuckles turned white. At the graveside, Marcus Hartwell led the final prayer. O Lord, receive thy servant Thomas, and grant peace to those who mourn. May light forever shine upon him, and may we who remain walk in faith, despite our sorrow. But beneath the hymns and prayers, something darker stirs. Even as they lowered the coffin, a question clung to the air. What had he meant by the book in the chapel, and why had he begged God for forgiveness? Dr. Whitley offered his reassurances. He suggested the illness may have been brought on by tainted food or exposure to a rare toxin, perhaps a mushroom or mold unknown to modern medicine. But no one was comforted. Not really. His words felt like gauze placed over an open wound, thin, useless, and insincere. The death of Thomas Milliken cracks the calm surface of seminary life. The snow fell harder, the winds rose, the buildings groaned under the weight of accumulating ice and quiet grief. And deep inside those stone walls, something had shifted. Students began to sleep restlessly. They dreamed of shadowed figures pacing the halls, of eyes in the walls, and whispers in forgotten languages. Some awoke screaming. Others reported hearing footsteps at night just beyond their doors. But when opened, the corridors were always empty. Anxiety crept in like a draft from the broken windowsills. The calm rhythm of lectures and study gave way to unease. Professors noted it in their classrooms. Professor Hartley found his Greek students unprepared, distracted, constantly looking toward the chapel, as though fearing it might speak. Professor Sterling, usually greeted with curiosity and excitement, noted that even his most vivid stories of early church councils were met with blank stares and furtive glances at the snow outside. Dr. Ashford, eliminating the unrest growing, attempted to restore order. He increased chapel services, encouraging students to lean into their faith. Special prayer meetings were arranged. Psalms were sung more often. The book of Job was studied in depth. Ashford hoped that discipline and devotion would provide an anchor. But though routines were followed and prayers were said, the shadow of Thomas's death refused to lift. No one knew it then, but the truth was already written into the walls. Thomas Milliken was not the end. He was the beginning. The dormitory where both Thomas Milliken and James Morrison had lived was immediately sealed and fumigated, the acrid smoke of sulfur and herbs billowing through the cold winter air. It was a standard response intended to treat miasmas and infections. But even as the fumes clung to the stone walls and drifted through the woods beyond, no one truly believed they were fighting a disease, because by now, no one believes this was a matter of medicine anymore. Fear had settled over Whitmore Seminary like a heavy, unmoving fog. It was in the way students averted their eyes in the chapel. In the way no one walked the halls alone after nightfall. In the way even the devout whisper prayers without believing they'd be answered. The seminary, once a sanctuary of learning and spiritual preparation, had become a place of dread. And every student knows it will happen again. Dr. Ashford did what he could. He increased chapel services, organized prayer vigils, Bible studies, hymn nights. He hoped that devotion might dispel dread or at least distract from it. He even wrote to the Presbyterian church authorities in Philadelphia, sending a report that was far more desperate than dignified. The response was swift. Reverend Dr. Jonathan Blackwood was on his way, a silver-haired crisis manager of the Presbyterian hierarchy. Blackwood had seen it all: financial scandals, theological heresies, political factionalism. But he had never faced this, and he will not arrive in time. On December 12th, 3 days after James Morrison's death, a third student fell ill. Samuel Brewster, the son of farmers, the joker, the optimist, the man with sun in his voice even in winter. And now, just another victim in a pattern that is no longer shocked, but chilled. It began once again at exactly 3 Surado a.m. convulsions. Blackened nails, twisted Latin, death 21 hours later. Final words spoken with starting lucidity. The book in the chapel. God forgive us all. There were no variations, no deviations. It was as though death was following a script. Dr. Whitley, once confident, once rational, was now a man unraveling by degrees. He began recording every symptom with near-obsessive precision pulse patterns, blood color, fever, progression, vocal content. But no data makes sense. These were not symptoms. These were signatures branded on each student exactly the same. 3 deaths, 3 times 21 hours, 3 times 3:00 a.m., 3 times the same final message. This wasn't just tragedy. It was a pattern designed by something with purpose. And that purpose, whatever it was, had nothing to do with bacteria. Dr. Blackwood arrived on December 15th to a community on the brink. With his crisp black coat, steel-rimmed glasses, and unwavering eyes, he projects the image of Presbyterian authority and stoic calm. But inside, he was shaken. He met immediately with Dr. Ashford, Dr. Whitley, and the senior professors. He heard the full account, the sequence, the precision, the impossibility. He asked questions, not just as a theologian, but as an investigator. Who were these boys? What did they read? Whom did they speak to? And why, in their final seconds, did they all invoke a book in the chapel? He walked the grounds, spoke to students, studied notes, read the medical records by candlelight. Then privately he prayed. His official conclusion: a new contagion, a yet unclassified disease, something natural if rare. He had seen plagues before epidemics that swept through whole communities before science could understand them. He assured the students this was no judgment, no curse, only a biological anomaly, and it will pass. But those close to him could see. His eyes said something else. He too had begun to wonder what kind of disease strikes only at 3:00 a.m. What contagion speaks fluent Latin, and what in God's name was in that book? Let me pause here for just a moment, my dear listener. If you're still with us, still nestled in the shadows of this long and winding story, tell me, where are you listening from? What state? What country? Does your town have old churches closed, libraries, forgotten cemeteries. And more importantly, do you think you could walk into that chapel and open that book? Now let us return to Whitmore Seminary, where the snow was still falling and the book remained unopened. Dr. Blackwood had spent his life guiding others through tragedy, but as Peter Cunningham was lowered into yet another hastily dug grave behind the chapel, Blackwood no longer whispers platitudes. He stood still in the cold wind, staring up at the steeple as if waiting for it to speak first. The words, "the book in the chapel," echoed endlessly in his mind. It wasn't metaphor. It wasn't poetic. It was instructional. That night after the funeral, while the students sat in silence over their meager supper of bread and broth, Dr. Blackwood entered the chapel alone. He didn't tell Dr. Whitley. He did not ask permission. He brought only a lantern, a notebook, and his faith, such as it still remains. The chapel, built of stone and walnut, creaked and sobbed like an old beast as he stepped inside. The lantern's glow flickered against the stained glass windows, throwing shadows that looked like figures, kneeling, weeping, writhing. The pulpit stood at the front, same as always. Behind it, the altar. And behind the altar, the carved wooden lectern meant only for sacred texts. There, resting in shadow, was a second book, not the worn, leather-bound Bible used in daily services, not a hymnal or prayer manual, but a thick, dust-caked volume bound in dark animal hide that Blackwood had never seen before. It had no title on its spine, no inscription, no markings save for an embossed sigil, a kind of interwoven cross, an eye ancient and impossible. He opened it. The pages were yellowed and cracked, but the ink was fresh, as if it had been written yesterday. The language inside wasn't English, not Greek, not Hebrew. At first glance, it looked like Latin, but the grammar was wrong. The structure is twisted, inverted, like a sacred language spoken backward. Blackwood felt something in his throat seized up. He couldn't explain it. It wasn't afraid. It was recognized, as if part of his soul knew this book, had always known it, and had spent a lifetime trying to forget. His hands trembled as he flipped through the pages. There were passages that resembled liturgy. But where holy texts asked for blessing, these demanded invitation. Where scripture cried out for light, this called forth obscurity. It was a mirror of the sacred, or perhaps its shadow. He closed the book with a sound that echoed like a thunderclap in the cold, hollow chapel, and as he turned to leave, he realized he was not alone. From the back of the chapel, just behind the last pew, stood Timothy Brennan, the youngest student. He was pale, thin, shaking, and he spoke in a whisper. "I saw them reading it, sir. All of them. After lights out. Thomas, James, Samuel, even Peter. They read it together. In the dark." Dr. Blackwood had investigated theological controversies. Before heresy trials, hidden heretical sects, ministers accused of misappropriation. He'd even once uncovered a secret baptismal rite that involved speaking in ancient tongues. But this was different, and yet those final words, spoken by 4 dying men, each just before death, haunted him with their consistency. The book in the chapel. God forgive us all. To Blackwood, this was not fevered delirium. It was a confession. He urged Dr. Ashford to permit a full search of the chapel. But Ashford resisted clinging to the sanctity of the space. We do not defile the house of God, based on the ramblings of the dying Ashford, insisted. They're not ramblings, Blackwood replied grimly. They are warnings. Ashford, ever the theologian and administrator, remains unmoved. He feared such an investigation would shatter what little trust remains among the students. But Blackwood, who had stared at the rot behind too many pious facades, knew what had to be done. Still, before he could act, fear spread like wildfire. By December 20th, the seminary was on the verge of collapse. Students refused their meals, convinced the food was poisoned. They stopped sleeping, jumping at the sound of every creaking floorboard, every gust of winter wind against the windows. Professor Hartley's lectures fell to whispers. Sterling's sermons were interrupted by spontaneous weeping and panicked prayers. Timothy Brennan, the youngest, was now a ghost of the boy who had arrived so eager to study. He wrote his mother a final letter, unsure if it would ever reach her. Even Marcus Hartwell, the rock among them, was written beginning to fray his voice, trembling when he led evening prayers, his hands twitching as he his own final words by candlelight. But on that very night, when hope was almost lost, a thread unraveled. Dr. Whitley, exhausted and sleepless in his temporary quarters in the faculty wing, heard a soft knock at his door. He opened it to find David Crane, the only remaining member of the original group of roommates, the man who had found Thomas Milliken convulsing in bed weeks earlier. David looked like he hadn't eaten or slept in days. His hands trembled, his lips were pale, and his eyes were hollow. "Doctor," he whispered, "I need to tell you something. Something I should have told the moment Thomas died." Dr. Whitley, his face worn and gaunt, still dressed in the same coat he'd worn at Peter Cunningham's funeral, silently gestured him in. David sat down, but he couldn't meet the doctor's eyes. Then he spoke. "We found something. A book. In the chapel. Hidden behind the altar. Thomas found it first. But we all read it. We thought it was just old theology. Maybe a lost work of Calvin or an early Puritan text. But it wasn't." He described how a group of 7 students had gathered in secret night after night, curious and bold, eager to uncover mysteries their professors never dared mention. The book was ancient, written in an archaic form of Latin none of them fully understood. But what they could translate spoke of heaven and hell in terms no one had ever heard in seminary. It contained rituals, not sermons. It speaks of portals, not parables. And it insisted over and over again that knowledge was power. But power came with price. We read it aloud, David admitted. Sometimes together, sometimes alone. We even joked about it, called it the Black Gospel. But something changed after that. The dreams began, the cold, the whispers. Dr. Whitley sat frozen. This was it. the first true link between the victims. They had not been chosen at random. They had been involved. David's voice cracked as he looked the doctor in the eye. Thomas was the first to speak those words from the book. James followed. Then Samuel. And Peter. I haven't read from it since. I haven't touched it. But I think it remembers me. There was silence, and then a single question from Dr. Whitley. Where is it now? David hesitated. His eyes drifted toward the window, toward the steeple visible in the moonlight. Still there, he whispered. Still in the chapel, waiting. Dr. Whitley listened as David Crane, pale as parchment and trembling as though fevered himself, spoke of things no theological student should ever utter. The book they had found, the book mentioned by every dying man, was not merely a curiosity. It was an artifact, bound, David claimed, in what they believed to be human skin, and not just old ancient, the kind of ancient that didn't feel dusty but wrong. The pages were a yellow-gray parchment that curled slightly at the corners and seemed too fibrous to be paper. And the text was written in Latin, yes, but interwoven with jagged symbols, Hebrew fragments, and characters no alphabet chart could identify. None of the 6 students, bright as they were, could translate it completely. But they understood enough. It had started innocently enough in early October. Thomas Milliken, ever dutiful, had been assigned to assist with maintenance in the chapel. The seminary's buildings, old and groaning with history, require near constant attention, and it was common for students to be tasked with mending worn floorboards or cleaning soot from the windows. Thomas had been sweeping near the altar when he noticed something strange. One of the foundation stones behind it seemed loose. Curious, he pressed on it, and it gave way with a quiet click. Behind it lies a hidden compartment untouched by time or dust. Inside, a book swaddled in decaying cloth. And next to it, a small bundle of unidentifiable objects, glass vials, a broken iron key, and a length of cloth embroidered with what looked like serpents forming a crown. Thomas, in his characteristic zeal, didn't tell a professor. He told his friends James Morrison, Samuel Brewster, Peter Cunningham, David Crane, and finally Marcus Hartwell, the oldest among them. 6 students bound not by doctrine but by curiosity. At first, David whispered, it was just studying, harmless, a mystery to solve. They met twice weekly after prayers under the hush of night, when the faculty were asleep and the chapel was empty. They gathered around the altar candles, lit low, the book placed carefully upon a cloth, and they read and copied and whispered. The language was strange, dense, yet hypnotic. The Latin wasn't biblical. It didn't quote from Paul or Augustine. It speaks of thresholds, of vessels, of binding and unbinding the soul. There were diagrams, spiral stars, and interlocking circles that didn't resemble anything they'd seen in Calvinist or Presbyterian studies. One symbol they noted was repeated frequently: 2 interwoven serpents, one devouring the other's tail. Thomas believed it was divine, David said. He said it had been given to us, that God had placed it in our path for a reason. Skepticism at first was high, but Thomas had a gift for persuasion. His fervor was magnetic. He spoke of enlightenment, of higher callings, of becoming preparations touched by deeper knowledge. They followed, not out of fear, but out of belief. At first, as doctor, Whitley sat frozen in his chair. David continued, now caught in the rush of confession. It changed us, he said. We started feeling apart from the others. Elevated. He described how the group grew secretive, even smug. They began fasting without instruction, speaking in tongues in their private prayers, seeing visions they believed were divine revelations. But it wasn't just theological. The book gave instructions, detailed rituals, spiritual exercises, as Thomas had called them, meditations that involved staring into candlelight for hours, chants, Latin, and something else meant to be recited at exactly 3:30 a.m. Restrictions on food and sleep, and instructions for building preparation chambers. These were small, sacred spaces marked by chalk circles and geometric patterns on the floor, lit by candles of specific colors, and filled with incense that Thomas had mixed from herbs in the seminary's apothecary cabinet. David's voice faltered as he recalled one ritual in particular. It requires one person to read while the others listen in silence. It says the silence must be absolute, that the listening must not be interrupted. Dr. Whitley interjected quietly. Did you complete that ritual? David nodded. And that was the night the dreams began. Not nightmares. Not exactly. Just voices. Names we didn't know. Places we couldn't find on a map. Sometimes I think I heard my own voice among them. Whitley said nothing, but his hands clenched the arms of his chair. This was no longer mere curiosity. It was ritualistic, systematic, and most disturbingly shared. Others had noticed something was wrong. Professor Sterling had remarked on the unusual smell that sometimes lingered in the chapel like smoke and rotting fruit. Professor Hartley once heard whispers while walking past after midnight, but upon entering, found nothing but silence. Ashford dismissed it all as overactive imaginations. But now, Whitley knew there was no denying the connection between those who had read the book and those who had died. And one more name had been added to that list, Marcus Hartwell, the last of the 6. He hadn't died, not yet, but he had been one of them, and he was still alive. For now. At Whitmore Seminary, 6 young men sought truth in a book that had no business being found. They studied it, chanted it, obeyed it, and now 4 were dead. What secrets lie in parchment, bound with human skin? What knowledge calls itself sacred, but echoes only in shadows? And what price is paid when we read something not meant for human eyes? Stay with us, because what Dr. Blackwood finds in that chapel will forever change the fate of the seminary, and perhaps far more. At first, what they practiced seemed harmless. In fact, it seemed miraculous. The 6 students, Thomas James, Samuel, Peter Marcus, and David, reported what they believed to be breakthroughs in their spiritual lives. They experienced vivid dreams encounters with radiant winged beings who whispered truths too profound for ordinary language. These dreams feel sacred baptisms of the mind. They awoke filled with energy, with a sense of divine mission, and with insight that made their regular coursework seem trivial by comparison. Even their professors noted the group was excelling. Fluency in ancient languages, sharper theological reasoning, a new, almost charisma presence during chapel discussions. To outside observers, they were simply gifted, privileged with intelligence, touched by grace. But enlightenment has a shadow, and soon the shadow grew darker. David's voice shook as he described the first signs: headaches, then insomnia, numbness in the fingers and toes, a tingling in the teeth when scripture was read aloud, then strange changes in diet. We stopped wanting the food from the refinery, he said. We craved meat, but undercooked, barely warm, bleeding. And then came the voices, especially for Thomas. He would stop mid-conversation, head tilted as though listening. When pressed, he'd say, "They're teaching me something. I just can't quite hear it yet." To Thomas, these were signs of favor. Pain was proof of progress. The burning in his gut, a purification fire, he called it. The voices in unidentifiable languages, angels, speak the tongue of Eden, and the others believed him. They needed to. As the group grew deeper in their studies, their worldview shifted. They began to see their classmates, those who stuck to Calvin and Edwards, and Augustine, as children playing with wooden swords. The six saw themselves as initiates, chosen. They no longer debated doctrine, they pronounced the truth. Even their interactions with professors soured. They grew impatient in lectures, quietly mocking what they saw as spiritual mediocrity. They had tasted something beyond the ordinary, and they were no longer content to be merely Presbyterian. But not all of them were at peace. Marcus Hartwell, eldest of the six, began to change. In mid-November, he confirmed in David. The dreams once radiant had twisted. The angels, their turn to masks. I wake with scripture faces bleeding from my mouth, but it's wrong. It's all wrong. The truths they'd once received now felt inverted. Divine revelations became parodies of sacred truths. Prayers ended in laughter. Visions turned grotesque. Marcus begged the group to stop, to seal the book away again, to confess what they had done. But Thomas was persuasive. He told Marcus that doubt was a test. This is the valley of shadow. Walk through it. You will be okay. And so the study continued. David's eyes welled with tears as he described those final weeks. Thomas had become obsessed. He stopped attending meals. His journals were filled with hand-drawn sigils, translated passages, and page after page of prophetic ramblings. He said we were being prepared. David whispered for something great, that we would change the church, that we would be its new apostles. But along with the grand visions came something else, fear. Thomas began muttering about test of worthiness, that if they weren't faithful, if they abandoned their studies, they would be judged. And the books, it gave warnings. One passage haunted David most. He who opens the gate but does not cross it shall be unmade in both flesh and spirit. For the eye watches, the seal holds, the book remembers. There were diagrams depicting men without faces, figures lying on ritual circles, their bodies dissolving into smoke and ash. It was allegory, they thought, until Thomas began to die. Dr. Whitley leans forward, now breathing shallow, eyes fixed. "Where is the book, David?" David went pale. His lips trembled, and then barely audible. "It's gone." 3 days before Thomas's first convulsion, the book had disappeared, vanished from its hiding place behind the altar. The group had panicked Thomas most of all. They turned the chapel upside down in secret, searching for it every night, praying in desperation for its return. Thomas became frantic. He insisted that without it, they would never complete the rituals, never seal what had been opened. He said, "We had started something that couldn't be undone," David whispered. "That we had opened a door, and something had come through, and now one by one they were dying. All of them. 6 students sought the knowledge of angels and found a fire that only the damned survived. Now the book is missing, and 5 of the 6 are dead or marked. But the door they opened, it is still open, and something has noticed. Stay with us, because what happens next in the chapel's hidden chamber is not a lesson in theology. It is a reckoning. On the cold, brittle evening of November 30th, the 6 students returned to the chapel for their regular meeting. They moved like conspirators through the halls, avoiding creaking floorboards, their breath held. As they entered the sacred space that had become their private cathedral of hidden truths. But something was wrong. The compartment behind the altar, where the book had rested for months, wrapped in cloth, like a relic from the days before the flood, was empty. The ancient volume, bound in what appeared to be human skin and inked in forgotten letters, had disappeared without a trace. Panic gripped the group. They turned over pew cushions, pulled up loose stones from the altar's base, climbed into the rafters with trembling hands and sputtering lanterns. But the book was gone. No signs of a break-in, no damaged locks, nothing. It was as though it had simply walked away. Thomas was the first to unravel, his eyes, already bloodshot from sleeplessness, now burned with paranoia. "They took it," he insisted. "Someone is watching us, spying on us. Maybe Sterling, maybe Hartley, maybe even Blackwood himself. He accuses classmates of betrayal, faculty of heresy. He was convinced that dark forces, human or otherwise, had stolen the book to halt their spiritual ascension." The others tried to calm him, but their own symptoms were worsening. The headaches became daily, the insomnia absolutely, and soon they began sharing the same dreams. They all described being chased through vast libraries made of bone, through endless black corridors lit by candles that whisper in tongues. Dark figures followed close behind, faceless and furious, shrieking in a voice like rusted iron, "Return what was taken. Return what was taken." Even in waking life, they began to feel watched. Mirrors warped their reflections. Candles flickered when they spoke Latin aloud. Books they had not touched fell from the shelves. But Thomas remained undeterred. "We are being tested," he told them. "This is judgment. This is initiation." He believed the book itself had not been stolen, but reclaimed. It's with us now, in us. The knowledge has passed into our blood. The others weren't so sure. David Crane's confession struck Dr. Whitley felt like a blow to the chest. Gone was the tidy hypothesis of contagion. This was no fever of the body. It was something older, a corruption of mind and soul masquerading as enlightenment. The deaths were not random. They were the toll exacted by something ancient, awakened by mistake or arrogance. Whitley, a man of medicine, now finds himself staring down a horror that would not fit between the lines of his anatomy texts. This was not scientific. This was something else. He shares everything with Dr. Blackwood. Blackwood, pragmatic, unflinching, forged by decades of church politics and whispering scandals, took the confession with chilling calm. Truth hides behind silence, he said. But silence never lasts forever. He launched a full investigation. Students were summoned. Faculty were questioned. Records were examined. What he uncovered was a conspiracy of silence. Nearly half the student body had known something. They had seen glowing light beneath the chapel door at midnight, heard chanting that was not in any hymnal, smelled incense that smelled more like burning flesh than frankincense. Some had been invited to join. Most had refused. Thomas asked me once, one student confessed. He said we were the new priests, that we could learn things the faculty were too afraid to teach. But fear had kept them quiet. Fear of punishment, fear of ridicule, and later fear of whatever was now killing them one by one. Professor Hartley, the Greek instructor, revealed what he had observed with growing alarm. Thomas, James, Peter, their recitations became performances. They corrected the Septuagint. They questioned Paul. They claimed the original text had been tampered with. What had once been passionate scholarship became heresy disguised as genius. Professor Sterling in church history noted a similar pattern. The group had grown dismissive, even disdainous of Reformed teachings. They told me Augustine was blind, Sterling said, that the real gospel had been hidden long before the Reformation, that the truth was buried and now unearthed. When asked for sources, they grew evasive. They spoke of dreams, of whispering truths, of a book you wouldn't understand. And now 4 of the 6 were dead. All had died exactly 21 hours after their symptoms began. All had spoken the same last words. All had been shaped by that book, the same book that had disappeared. Without a sound, without a trace, without explanation. And the 2 who remained, Marcus Hartwell, David Crane, one filled with dread, the other now haunted by what he had helped unleash. But whatever force had claimed the others, it was not done. Not yet. The truth unearthed by Dr. Blackwood's investigation was more horrifying than any whispered rumor that had passed through the dormitory halls of Whitmore Seminary. What began as a spiritual curiosity had ripened into a full-blown apostasy, practiced in secret and cloaked in piety. For nearly 3 months, the group had gathered by candlelight in the chapel, kneeling not before the cross, but before a mystery wrapped in flesh, bound in symbols older than Sinai and stranger than Rome. 6 students, 6 minds, 6 vessels: the Inner Circle, Thomas Millikan, James Morrison, Samuel Brewster, Peter Cunningham, David Crane, and Marcus Hartwell, had slowly drifted from the humble orthodoxy of Presbyterian teaching into something far more dangerous. They didn't study Calvin or Augustine. They did not debate the finer points of soteriology or covenant theology. They studied power. Revelation unblessed by church or scripture. A knowledge that demands secrecy and fed on pride. They became elitists, cloaked in spiritual arrogance, whispering of greater truths and hidden light. They mocked their peers as sleepwalkers. They called their professors blind scribes. And slowly, their spiritual pride became the seedbed of something monstrous. Dr. Blackwood had seen it before, though never in such a form. In his long tenure within the church, he had encountered false revivals, cultic schisms, and charismatic deviations that fractured congregations and hollowed out faith. But this was different. This had all the marks of possession, not of the body, but of doctrine. When pride masquerades as piety, he once wrote, it invites spirits not from heaven, but from the chasm beneath it. And now he feared that the deaths were not punishment from God, but the result of an unfinished ritual. Despite Dr. Ashford's protests, clinging still to the sanctity of the chapel like a man hugging a corpse, Dr. Blackwood ordered a full search. What they uncovered chilled even the most rational among them. Behind the altar, the hidden compartment, just as David described, now empty. Traces of wax and soot from extinguished candles. Smudged symbols etched into stone, half erased, as though someone had tried to scrub sin itself from the walls. The faint smell of burned myrrh, and something sharper beneath it. Something wrong. Then came the discovery that unlocked the door to madness. A stack of papers hidden in a recess behind the chapel's southern wall, wrapped in cloth, carefully concealed. These were Thomas Millikan's notes. They were written in a hand that began clear and scholarly. It would page by page, line by line, devolved into feverish scrawl and symbols that shift before the eye. They detailed conversations with messengers of fire and veil, dreams where the students walked upon the glass sea of heaven and saw behind the throne. Practices for opening the gates of communion between realms. Diagrams for circles, symbols, and incantations that bore no resemblance to any Christian liturgy. One phrase repeated several times in ink so heavy it bled through the parchment read, "To awaken the vessel, the flesh must be marked. The mouth must speak. The blood must burn." And then, most disturbing of all, a ritual, a ceremony requiring 6 participants each, designated as a vessel of divine manifestation. It mentioned that once performed, this ritual would permit contact with a presence beyond the veil, a being described as the radiant architect, whose words are fire and whose shadow brings light. To open the gate was to invite revelation, but to abandon it halfway was to invite judgment. Dr. Whitley, ever the man of reason, found himself on the edge of collapse. This was not contagion, not hallucinations, not madness alone. This was resulted the aftershock of spiritual trespass. They began something, and then they lost the book. They broke the circle. They let the gate open, but never closed it. And now, one by one, the six were being claimed. Their bodies twisted, their minds burned. Their final words, the book in the chapel, God forgive us all, were not pleased. They were warnings. 4 were dead. 2 remains, David and Marcus. David had confessed. But Marcus was beginning to act strangely. He didn't sleep. He barely spoke. He was whispering to empty corners of his dormitory, and in his writings, later recovered by faculty, he repeated only one phrase. The 5th seal breaks with dawn. December 22nd arrived like a whisper of doom at Whitmore Seminary. Outside, the Pennsylvania sky was leading heavy with the promise of snow. Inside the seminary's hallways, echoed with the fragile silence of too many prayers unanswered, and David Crane, the last living member of the secret study group, could feel something watching him. Not from outside his window, not from down the corridor, from within. That morning he did not attend chapel. He didn't eat. He sat in his room, writing furiously in his journal pages, soaked in ink and tears, recording dreams he no longer understood, and visions that refused to leave when he opened his eyes. In those visions he saw a throne of black stone surrounded by weeping angels, a great veil torn open by hands of flame, and his 5 dead friends no longer suffering, but smiling, their mouths filled with stars and ash, and always a voice behind it all saying, one more, just one more, and the way shall open. Dr. Whitley had grown pale and drawn. He'd given up trying to explain the deaths medically. Dr. Blackwood had resorted to old prayers, drawn from forgotten corners of Reformation liturgy texts, meant for spiritual warfare, for casting out heresies that did not bleed, but still devoured. The 2 men had posted a student outside David's room. They feared contagion. They feared madness. They feared repetition. But what they found that evening was not death yet. Just before dusk, David Crane disappeared. He slipped out of his room, out of the building, and into the chapel. The place where it all began, there by flickering candlelight, he recreated the ritual space, using memory, using Thomas's old notes, using blood his own cut from his palm, and dripped in a perfect circle. I'm the last, he whispered. I must finish what we started. He believed in the last hours of his unraveling mind that he could end the curse by completing the ritual, but he was also feared that he was wrong. If I am marked, he wrote in his journal before he left, then let the mark be fulfilled. I am not afraid to die. I am only afraid that it will mean nothing. It was a maintenance worker who found him around 11 p.m. curled in front of the altar like a child sleeping after fever. But David was not asleep. His eyes were open. His body is stiff. His fingernails blackened. The 6th death had come, but this time there was no convulsing, no screaming, no Latin. Instead, carved into the chapel floor beside him, etched with exacting precision, the gate is open. Dr. Whitley collapsed. Dr. Blackwood fell to his knees and wept not out of grief, but because in that moment he felt something leave the room, not a soul ascending, something descending, a pressure in the air, a weight behind the eyes, the sound of breath where no one breathed. "We have failed," he whispered. So what was the book? Where did it come from? What had the 6 students truly summoned? And more importantly, what now walks the halls of Whitmore Seminary, wearing no face, bearing no name, but leaving shadows colder than snow? Join us next time as we descend deeper into the origin of the book and uncover the dark legacy buried beneath Whitmore's founding in 1796, a legacy drenched in heresy murder and a forgotten exorcism that history tried to bury, but the chapel walls remember. The trial of Reverend Josiah Whitmore was a sensation in its day, covered in whispered sermons, scandalized letters, and ecclesiastical decrees. It rocked the Presbyterian community to its very foundations. A respected minister turned occultist, a spiritual leader turned death bringer. He was convicted not just of heresy, but of murder. By means the court barely understood ritualistic spiritual arcane. Yet, instead of being executed as many demanded, Whitmore disappeared. The historical record lists him as removed from ministry and banned from Pennsylvania. But the letters hidden in that bricked-up chamber told a darker truth. The hidden legacy. David Crane's trembling hands uncovered journals in Whitmore's own handwriting pages, written during his final months in hiding. These were not the ravings of a madman, but the meticulous records of a man who believed he had glimpsed the divine veil and pierced it. The ceremony failed. One passage reads, not because the path was wrong, but because the vessels were unprepared. He believed the 6 congregants had died not from spiritual corruption, but from insufficient purification. He vowed to try again. But this time, he will build the temple himself, the seminary that should never have been. In the final pages, Josiah described his plan to purchase a tract of land, remote, quiet, and already rumored to be cursed by Lenape legends of sleeping gods beneath the stone. He will build a place of learning, a place of prayer, a place where the veil could be lifted correctly. He would bury his tools, his books, and his knowledge beneath the altar. And someday, when the time was right, he wrote others would find them. Younger yeast, hungry souls, ones willing to finish what he had begun. And now in 1923, they had. David Crane knew what he had found. He knew that the seminary was not named to honor a man of God. It was named for a heretic, an occultist, a killer whose greatest crime had yet to be completed. The deaths of his 5 friends were not random, not a mystery. They were echoes, reverberations of a ritual never finished. David believed he still had time to stop it, but the journal hinted at one final horror. Whitmore had written of a 7th vessel, a final sacrifice needed only if the others fail. The 7th shall bind the gate. His death shall be the key. David had assumed the group needed 6, but the ritual may have always required 7, and if so, David Crane was not the last survivor. He was the final offering. Dr. Blackwood and Dr. Whitley was stunned as David unfolded everything he'd discovered. The secret chamber, the heretical legacy of the seminary's namesake, the prophecy of 7 vessels. They tried to protect him. They moved David into their own quarters, forbade him from being alone, kept constant prayer vigils, but they were too late. December 23rd, 3:00 a.m., David Crane died exactly as the others had. Convulsions, blackened fingers, a final whisper, not pleading, not afraid, but resolute. It is finished, and carved into his chest. No blade, no hand seen with the words, "The gate is bound." Closing reflection, slow, quiet, mournful. 6 dead students, 1 heretic founder. A book now gone, its pages may still whispering beneath the chapel floor or in some hidden vault waiting to be reopened. Whitmore Seminary was closed indefinitely. The building boarded up. The name struck from the rolls of the Presbyterian Church. The land sold, then abandoned. No one has set foot in that chapel since 1923. But some say if you stand outside it on a winter night, you can hear the whispers of Latin prayers not found in any Christian liturgy, and sometimes a name Whitmore, spoken not in recovery, but in warning. December 23rd, 1923, 4:17 a.m. The seminary was silent, not with peace but with dread. In the flickering candlelight of the old chapel, David Crane stood alone, his breath visible in the cold air, his hands trembling, his skin pale and fevered. He had read every word, understood every symbol, and now he knew what had to be done. The grimoire's last warning. The instructions were specific, cruelly so. The counter-ritual would require the grimoire itself fully intact. A circle of reversal drawn in ash and chalk over the original gateway markings. The final vessel, the 7th, standing at the center. The entity, whatever, lay just beyond the veil, would not allow interference. To begin the counter-ritual would be to provoke it. Whitmore had written, "They are hungry things, patient but jealous. Once awakened, they will devour what is theirs." David had no illusions. To perform the counter-ritual was to offer yourself completely. Body, mind, soul. 4:41 a.m., the circle was drawn. He worked in silence, surrounded by the ghosts of his friends. He could almost hear Thomas Milliken laughing softly in the dark. He could feel Marcus's quiet resolve behind him. He whispered their names like prayers as he copied the reversal incantations. James, Peter, Samuel, Marcus, Thomas, and then his own voice, David, a name soon to join the others. He placed the grimoire at the altar open to the final page. The candles flared violently. The shadows grew longer. The ritual begins. The language he spoke had no human tongue. It felt carved into his bones, not learned from a page. The wind outside howled like an animal. The chapel's wooden beams groaned and popped. The smell of sulfur filled the air. Blood oozed from the cracks in the floor. The walls bled scripture in reverse Latin, and then a sound, not of this world. A shriek, a roar, a choir of voices that were neither alive nor dead. David screamed the final line, his voice joining the chorus of the damned and the divine. The grimoire ignited, bursting into white fire. The pages curled inward. The runes glowed, then collapsed into ash. The air split open for one horrifying moment. The gate opened, and what peered through was not God. It was vast. It was old. It had waited since 1782, and now, denying its seventh vessel, it reached the final sacrifice. David Crane collapsed within the circle. Every candle blew out. Every window shattered. And when the faculty rushed into the chapel, they found ashes, blood, a single scorch mark where David had stood, and silence. The grimoire was gone. The markings had disappeared. The chapel floor, once carved with occult symbols, was smooth stone again. The deaths stopped. No more students fell ill. The burning whispers fade from the walls. The air, though still cold, no longer tastes of sulfur and rot. Dr. Blackwood called it a miracle. Dr. Whitley called it closure. But others whisper different words. Martyr, savior, final vessel, postscript, January 1924. Whitmore Seminary was permanently closed. The Presbyterian Church issued a quiet withdrawal of its historical records, stripping Josiah Whitmore's name from official recognition. The chapel was sealed. The surrounding land sold to a private buyer who promptly fenced it off and never developed it. As for David Crane, no grave, no ceremony, just a simple plaque placed in the seminary's overgrown garden by Dr. Whitley himself. It reads, "He gave everything to protect what we could not understand. In memory of David Crane, 1903-1923. Some say the ritual was broken. Some say the gate was sealed. But a few those who still wake screaming from strange dreams believe that Whitmore's work succeeded. Just not in the way he expected. Because if you stand in the ruins of that chapel on a cold December night, you might still hear 6 voices chanting and a 7th whisper asking you to read the book. December 23rd, 11:58 p.m., the chapel of Whitmore Seminary. 4 men stood in a place no longer holy. By candlelight and faith alone, they braced themselves against a darkness that had been seeded into the very foundation of Whitmore Seminary nearly 150 years ago. The grimoire burned, the veil thinned, and David Crane, pale shivering black veins creeping up his forearms, became the axis upon which this terrible story would turn. The final words of the grimoire, as the last few pages curled in flame, David began to whisper, not in pain, not in fear, but in clarity. He spoke the names not just of the dead students, but of the 6 original congregants who had died in 1781 under Whitmore's hand. "They are watching," he said. "They want release. They do not blame us. Only him." Dr. Blackwood continued the liturgy with a strength that seemed not his own. He read from Ephesians, from Psalms, from Revelation. "We wrestle not against flesh and blood." And then it came, a low groan from beneath the floorboards, a shrieking wind through the sealed chapel windows, the smell of charred meat and old soil, the manifestation, the floor split, not physically, but spiritually. A seam opened between worlds, a cold, lightless crack that bled whispers and claws of thought. trying to pull David into the beyond. Shapes took form in the smoke, 6 of them, the friends he had buried, standing like shadows, lit from within. Behind them, something else loomed, something vast. Not demonic, not exactly, but hungry and old and stitched from every heresy that had ever tempted mankind. Dr. Whitley fell to his knees. Dr. Ashford wept openly. David stood alone at the center of the circle, bleeding from his eyes, yet smiling. Narrator, softer, more intimate now. "Let me carry it," he said. And with those words, the shadows froze. The monstrous force recoiled, and the grimoire in its final instant of burning howled. A sound not of paper or fire, but of something ancient losing its grip. David dropped to his knees. The candle flames flared blue, and then silence. The pressure lifted. The cracking stopped. The cold began to ease. The book was gone. Ashes only, and David Crane was alive. December 24th, 1923, dawn. David awoke on the chapel floor, his body weak, his skin burned where the dark veins had reached. But he was alive. The ritual had been broken. The final vessel had not been claimed. The gate had closed. The seminary's long nightmare had ended, but what David had seen, what he had become, could not be forgotten. Aftermath. Whitmore Seminary was officially dissolved on January 12th, 1924. The Presbyterian Church issued a confidential report that acknowledged significant theological irregularities and spiritual danger. The building was razed by summer. All land records of the seminary were quietly sealed. As for David Crane, he left to study theology. He disappeared from public life. Only Dr. Whitley maintains contact, receiving occasional postcards, always from remote monasteries or far-off retreats, places where silence was kept and prayer was constant. The last card, dated December 23rd, 1948, read simply, "The veil holds, but it whispers still. DC." They say no one has stepped onto the old Whitmore grounds in decades, but those who camp nearby sometimes hear, chanting with no source, the smell of burned parchment on the wind, or footsteps just behind them in the frozen grass. And once a year, on December 23rd, a single candle is found burning at the edge of the ruined chapel's foundation. No footprints, no matches, just light. And maybe, remember. And so, the story of Whitmore Seminary came to a silent, unceremonious end. No plaques, no memorial, no mention in official histories of the Presbyterian Church. The land was left untouched, a scar hidden beneath weeds and silence. What remains? The deaths of 15 students, the collapse of an entire institution, and a book that should never have existed, destroyed at last, but not without leaving its mark. David Crane, once a promising seminarian full of hope and calling, became a quiet and solitary figure in the church's records. He was transferred to a remote parish in upstate New York, where he ministered faithfully for over 50 years. Parishioners said he was kind, wise, but that he kept strange hours and never looked directly into mirrors. Each December, he fasted in solitude. And on December 23rd, every year, he will light 6 candles, then sit alone until they burned to nothing. When asked, he would simply say, "For the ones who walked too far." The echoes of heresy. Theological scholars today still argue over the so-called Whitmore event. Most church records refer to it only obliquely, if at all. A footnote here, a missing semester there. But some old files remain in the Presbyterian Historical Society, sealed and marked with red wax. Those who've seen the files speak of geometric diagrams drawn in blood, student notebooks filled with angelic letters, and a single surviving scrap of the grimoire, burned at the edges but with 5 words still legible. "He that opens becomes the gate." And what of the land? The chapel was demolished in the spring of 1924. The basement was filled in and the surrounding woods allowed to grow. But hikers have reported strange phenomena for decades. Trees that seem to grow in perfect spirals, cold spots even in the height of summer, and dreams shared by multiple campers of a young man in a seminary uniform whispering, "Tell them not to read." Local children dare each other to spend a night at Whitmore Hill. Most don't make it till dawn. The story of Whitmore Seminary is not one of ghosts. It is the story of hubris, of spiritual arrogance, wrapped in holy language, of men who believed they were chosen and instead became consumed. In their quest for divine revelation, they found something far older and far less forgiving. And though the seminary is gone and the book is ash, some things do not die. They wait. And that is the forgotten story of Whitmore Seminary, a place born of hope, transformed by pride, and buried by silence. The 15 dead students were not heretics, not bad people, just young men who believed too deeply in their own choices. Men mistook whispers in the dark for the voice of God. Silent graves, their graves now forgotten, tell no tale of the horrors they endured. Plain stones, dates etched by hands afraid of the truth. No mention of blasphemous rituals, blackened fingernails, or burned Bibles. Only names. And the silence of the earth, the sealed archives, David Crane's letters, Dr. Whitley's forbidden notes, and Dr. Blackwood's red-waxed report, all buried in the archives of the Presbyterian Historical Society, stored under layers of bureaucracy and dust. Only fragments remain. But are those fragments enough? Enough to see the pattern, enough to know that this is more than a mistake. It is a warning, the last echo. They built the seminary on cursed ground, named after a man who died not in battle but in disgrace, burned by truth, not war. And though the grimoire has been burned to ashes, walkers in the woods behind the old grounds still whisper of dreams. Dreams of 6 figures in black robes. Dreams of a cold chapel with an invisible choir. Dreams of being chosen and swallowed. The lasting. David Crane died a loyal, broken man. He never sought fame. He never published his story. But if you read between the lines of his sermons, you will see a quiet horror. A man who once opened a door and spent the rest of his life trying to close it. He never quite succeeded. So what really happened at Whitmore Seminary? Was it a case of spiritual deception, occult intervention, mass hysteria, or the slow disintegration of young minds under the weight of sin and ambition? We may never know, but what is clear is that the past is never truly buried. And even sealed archives can whisper, echoes in doctrine. In the years since the tragedy, the Presbyterian Church has quietly rewritten its playbook. Close surveillance, banning extracurricular activities, subtly but unmistakably emphasizing the dangers of esoteric faith. They never mentioned the name Whitmore, but his shadow loomed over every seminary classroom, every whispered prayer, every student who dared to believe they had been chosen. Theories and doubts. Modern scholars offer many explanations. Some blame a collective mental illness, a shared delusion of guilt, fear, and isolation. Others suggest toxic herbs, psychotropic compounds, hidden in the rituals, a tragic alchemical cocktail. Others whisper of poison, a calculated silence by someone in power. But none of these explanations explains the chilly air of the chapel, or the blackened fingertips, or the seizures that struck in the middle of the night. And none of them explains how David Crane survived. The last line of faith. Theologians, however, are less skeptical. They see in the pattern of the deaths the unshakable timing and the final screams of Latin prayers, not science, not paranoia, but the touch of something ancient, something hungry. They believe the grimoire is real. Those deaths were sacrifices. And David's survival came not from chance, but from God's mercy, bought at the price of innocence. Today, the building is just a house. Visitors comment on the coldness of the living room, the strange shadows on the stairs, the way the rooms seem not entirely empty, even when no one is there. And deep beneath the floor, where Josiah Whitmore once carved his plans into stone, there may still be traces. Faint, waiting. Whitmore Seminary story. Summary setting. A Presbyterian seminary in rural Pennsylvania, founded on cursed land unbeknownst to the mysterious pastor Josiah Whitmore. Central mystery. A mysterious book. A study group of 6 students and a pattern of supernatural deaths with consistent symptoms and blasphemous last words. Themes. The dangers of spiritual pride and secret knowledge. The limits of rationalism as seen in Dr. Whitley's Deciphering. The weight of history and how the evils of the past infect the present. The power and cost of redemption through David Crane's self-sacrifice. Climax, a counter-ritual to cut through a decades-old demonic portal ending with David alive, but spiritually marked and the seminary closed forever. Generational silence, hidden truths, lost graves, forgotten sacrifices, but also a rare victory. No lingering haunting, no awakening evil. Just a silent memory of what happens when faith is distorted by ambition. Today, little remains to mark the presence of the seminary that once stood at the edge of the Pennsylvania woods. No plaques commemorate the lost students. No church records acknowledge the true cost of ambition cloaked in piety. But some say that in the early morning fog, when the fields are still and the livestock silent, you can hear faint echoes beneath the earth. A murmuring that doesn't belong to wind or animal or machine. Some say is the voices of those who sought to speak with heaven, and instead opened a door to something much older and colder than they ever imagined. Others insist it's nothing more than the imagination playing tricks on a quiet farm. But every few decades, local children dare each other to sneak into the old family house, especially the room that used to be the chapel. And when they emerged, pale-faced and trembling, none of them ever wanted to go back. And perhaps that is the final lesson of Whitmore Seminary, that evil once invited does not politely excuse itself. It must be driven out with fire prayer and sacrifice, and even then, it leaves scars on the land and soul. The tale survives not in textbooks or sermons, but in the unease that lingers just beneath the surface, in locked drawers, hushed family stories, and unspoken warnings, passed from one generation to the next. Some truths, it seems, are too dark for daylight, too dangerous for doctrine, and too sacred in their horror to be fully forgotten. And that is the story of Whitmore Seminary, a school that transformed from a training ground for preachers of the faith into a gateway to forces men should never name. 15 young men died not for sin, but for holy ambition. They yearned for God, but stumbled upon something only demons could. David Crane survived, but bore indelible scars both in his soul and in his faith. The letters he left behind are not just evidence, but a warning to all who would dare believe they held secrets that history has tried to bury. Today, on that once cursed land, only a peaceful farmhouse remains. The family who lived there knew nothing of the prayers whispered in the middle of the night, or the screams that once shook the stone walls of the chapel. But sometimes when the winter wind blows through Millbrook, and the moonlight shines down on the cold parlor where last rites were performed, it is said that you can hear the prayers of a spirit still asking for forgiveness. Maybe you believe in the supernatural. Maybe you don't. But remember, the truth doesn't need you to believe in it to survive. Some secrets have been buried. Some doors have been locked. But the question remains, and perhaps still whispers in the dark. Do we know the whole truth, or just the part it allows us to see? Thank you for following this story. If you believe that the ancients still leave their mark on the modern world, please share this video and leave a comment. What do you think really happened in the winter of 1823? And as always, be careful what you look for. Because sometimes knowledge is the path to darkness.